This story is titled, "My Wife Left for a Month-Long Trial with Her Lover, Saying She'd Choose Between Us After, but I Made It Simple by Filing for Divorce." Alright, so here I am, putting this out into the void of the internet because I honestly need to get it off my chest. My name's Mike, I'm 31 years old, and until a few months ago, I thought I had my life all figured out. Nothing flashy, nothing too wild, just a simple, predictable life that worked for me. I have a steady job as a software developer, a modest but comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, and for a long time, I thought I had something even better. A strong, loving marriage with a woman I truly cared about. Laura and I met 8 years ago, which feels like a lifetime ago now. I was 23 back then, fresh out of college and completely clueless about where I was headed. I just started my first job and everything about adulthood felt overwhelming. Laura, on the other hand, was 22 and working as an assistant at a marketing agency. She was also figuring things out, trying to carve out a career path that, spoiler alert, never really happened. She ended up as a stay-at-home wife. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue, a typical backyard gathering where everyone's balancing cheap paper plates while pretending not to notice the guy who's completely botching the grill. Laura was the one who approached me. She cracked this sarcastic joke about how I looked like I was plotting my escape route. I have no memory of what I said back, but she laughed, and that was it. Somehow, we ended up talking the rest of the night. Things moved fast after that. We started dating, and suddenly, my life, which had always felt kind of dull and structured, had this spark to it. Laura was spontaneous and adventurous, the kind of person who could convince you to take a road trip with zero planning or try out some weird restaurant just because she read about it online. I, on the other hand, was the planner. I'd be the one figuring out the budget, making sure the gas tank was full, or checking the weather to avoid disasters. We were opposites in so many ways, but somehow it worked, or at least I thought it did. She brought excitement into my life, and I gave her the sense of stability she said she had never had in past relationships. 3 years in, we got married. It was a small wedding, just close family and friends. Neither of us came from money, so there were no grand ballrooms or catered feasts. Honestly, none of that mattered to me. What mattered was building a life together. After the wedding, we bought a small 2-bedroom house in the suburbs. It wasn't anything fancy, but it felt like a good start. I thought we were on the same page about building a future. For a while, things felt stable, even happy. I'd go to work, come home, and Laura would usually be in the kitchen or curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She always had stories, some new drama at her marketing job or something random she came across online. She was the talker, the one who filled the silence, and I was the listener. That was our dynamic. We didn't have kids, but that was intentional. Neither of us felt ready, financially or emotionally, to take that step. It felt like we were aligned on that front. Looking back, though, I can see how easy it is to get too comfortable. Routines have a way of sneaking up on you. My days became a loop. Wake up, work, come home, repeat. Sure, we still had date nights, dinners at our favorite restaurants, the occasional movie, but I stopped noticing the smaller things. Like how much Laura thrived on attention. She was the kind of person who could light up a room, who people naturally gravitated toward. At first, I loved that about her. Over time, though, I think I started taking it for granted, assuming it was just part of our life together. At the time, I wasn't worried. I thought we were solid. Sure, we had arguments. What couple doesn't? Most of the time, it was over trivial things, me forgetting to take the trash out, her leaving her shoes all over the house. Nothing that seemed like a big deal. But here's the thing about relationships. They can look fine on the surface while cracks are quietly forming underneath. Those cracks? I didn't see them until they were too big to ignore. And if you are not paying attention, those cracks can spread, quietly creeping along until the entire foundation starts to crumble. The worst part is, you do not see it happening, not until it is far too late. I thought we were solid, building something strong, unshakable even, something that would stand the test of time. But life has a way of blindsiding you, hitting you with the realization that you might have been completely wrong. 2 years ago, our lives got a new addition, Jake. He moved in next door after the older couple who lived there decided to downsize and retire to Florida. Jake was younger than most of the folks in the neighborhood, probably around 28. He was a personal trainer, fit, confident, and, honestly, too good-looking for his own good. He had the kind of physique that made heads turn, the sort of look that would make you wonder if he had just stepped off the set of an action movie. From the moment he arrived, Jake was hard to miss, not just because of how he looked, but because he always seemed to be doing something outside. Washing his car, mowing the lawn, setting up a pull-up bar in his yard. There was always a reason for him to be out there, often shirtless. It did not take long for him to become the talk of the neighborhood. And Laura noticed him right away. How could she not? Everyone did. The first time we officially met Jake, he came over to introduce himself while we were in the yard on a sunny Saturday morning. He had this easy, approachable charm, the kind that made you feel like you had been friends for years, even though you had only just met. Laura struck up a conversation with him almost instantly, asking him where he was from, what he did for work, and how he was settling into the area. I remember standing there, smiling and nodding, barely able to get a word in edgewise as the two of them chatted effortlessly. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Laura was outgoing. She could strike up a conversation with anyone. She was just as talkative with the mail carrier or the cashier at the grocery store. It never occurred to me that her interest in Jake might be different. But looking back now, I can see the subtle changes that started to take shape after that. It began with the casual conversations. Whenever Jake was outside, Laura seemed to find reasons to be outside too. At first it was little things, grabbing the mail, watering the plants, or taking out the trash. But somehow those quick errands always seemed to stretch into 10 or 15 minutes of chatting with Jake. One time, I came home from work and found them talking in the driveway. Laura was holding a laundry basket mid-task, and Jake was leaning casually against his car, laughing at something she had said. When I walked up, they both turned to me, and Laura acted like it was nothing out of the ordinary. Jake was just telling me about his new gym equipment, she explained, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. But it didn't stop there. A couple of weeks later, Laura decided to bake cookies, a rare occurrence. I didn't think much of it until I saw her walking across the yard with a plate of cookies in hand. Just being neighborly, she said when I asked her about it. I shrugged it off. It was not unusual for Laura to do things like that. She had baked for other neighbors before. But then there was the new workout gear, bright fitted leggings and a matching top, far flashier than anything she would normally wear. When I asked about it, she told me she was thinking about getting back into jogging. You know, to get back in shape, she said casually. I did not question it. Laura had gone through fitness phases before, usually getting enthusiastic about working out for a month or two before losing interest. But this time, the timing felt convenient. You see, Jake jogged almost every morning. I would see him out there, earbuds in, running laps around the block like clockwork. And, as if by coincidence, Laura's new jogging routine just happened to start at the exact same time Jake was out there. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I caught them talking on the sidewalk. Laura was stretching, and Jake was showing her some kind of technique to avoid shin splints. It was innocent enough on the surface, just neighbors chatting about fitness. But the way she laughed at something he said, the way he leaned in to demonstrate the stretch, it was different. Looking back now, I can see that was just one of the many small cracks forming in our foundation. I didn't say anything, just gave a small wave and drove off. But something about the whole scene stuck with me, lingering in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. It was subtle at first, but once I noticed it, I couldn't shake the feeling. Around that time, I began picking up on small changes in Laura's behavior. Little things, like how she used her phone. Laura had always been the type to scroll endlessly through social media, texting her friends or sharing memes she thought were hilarious. But lately, she seemed different. She'd become more guarded, almost secretive. I'd walk into the room and she'd lock her screen so quickly it felt deliberate. Or sometimes she'd flip her phone over on the table like she didn't want me to see what was on it. Once, late at night, I noticed her scrolling through Instagram. I casually glanced over and caught Jake's name at the top of the screen. Before I could process it, she swiped past, acting like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing to me. When I asked her about it, she barely hesitated. "Oh, I was just looking at his fitness posts," she said, waving it off like it was no big deal. "He's got some good workout tips." I wanted to believe her. I really did. So I let it go. For the moment, anyway. but the small things kept adding up. A few days later, I was out in the garage working on a project. It was quiet except for the occasional hum of a drill, and then I heard laughter coming from the backyard. Curious, I stepped outside. There was Laura, standing by the fence with Jake. She had a glass of iced tea in her hand, and he was gesturing animatedly as he told some story. They were both laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. When she noticed me, she smiled and waved, acting like everything was perfectly normal. Later, when I asked her about it, she said, "Jake was just telling me this funny thing that happened at his gym." Again, I tried to brush it off, but something about the way she said his name felt different, like it carried more weight than it should. The changes weren't just in her actions, but in how she talked about him too. Out of nowhere, Jake became a regular topic in our conversations. "Jake's thinking about getting a dog," she'd say casually. Or, "Jake recommended this great protein shake." The words themselves were innocent, sure, but it was the way she said them, her tone, the way her eyes lit up a little more than usual, that made me take notice. Then there were the glances. You know the kind I mean. When we were all outside and Jake happened to be around, I'd catch her sneaking these quick looks in his direction. Subtle, but once you start noticing them, you can't unsee them. At that point, I still hadn't confronted her. Part of me didn't want to believe there was anything to worry about. We'd been together for years, and I thought we were solid. But the other part of me, the part that had started seeing patterns, couldn't ignore it. I decided to stay quiet for now and just pay closer attention. If something was happening, I wanted to see it for myself. It was a Saturday morning, and I remember it vividly because it started out so normal. I woke up early, like I usually do, made a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table scrolling through the news on my phone. The house was quiet, with nothing but the hum of the coffee machine in the background. Laura was still in bed, which wasn't unusual. She loved her lazy weekend mornings. For a moment, everything felt fine, almost peaceful. Funny how that works, right? You think everything's okay because you don't know what's coming. An hour later, Laura wandered into the kitchen. She was still in her pajamas, her hair a mess, holding her phone in one hand and rubbing her eyes with the other. She sat down across from me at the table, and right away, I could tell something was off. She had this nervous energy about her, tapping her fingers on the table, glancing at her phone, avoiding eye contact. "You okay?" I asked, setting my phone down. She nodded at first, but then shook her head. "Actually, no," she said, letting out a deep breath. "We need to talk." And let me tell you, anyone who's ever been in a relationship knows those 4 words rarely lead to anything good. My stomach dropped, but I tried to stay calm. "All right," I said, leaning back in my chair. "What's going on?" Laura hesitated, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for the right words, or maybe a way out of the conversation. Finally, she looked at me and said, "I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it." She paused, taking another deep breath. "I think I have feelings for Jake." For a second, I thought I misheard her. "What?" I leaned forward instinctively, as if getting physically closer might somehow make her words make more sense. Her eyes darted away, and she bit her lip, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said quickly, like she was trying to get ahead of whatever storm she thought was coming. "It just happened. I've been spending time with Jake, and there's this connection, and now I'm confused." That word, confused. It hit me harder than anything else she could have said. She didn't say she felt guilty, or that it was a mistake, or that she regretted it. She said she was confused, like this was some kind of moral puzzle she had to work out, some life decision that deserved to be weighed with pros and cons. I stared at her, trying to wrap my head around the situation. My brain was moving a mile a minute, but every thought was hitting a wall. Was she saying she wanted to leave? Was this her asking for a divorce? Or was she just trying to ease her own guilt by confessing so she could move on without it weighing her down? I couldn't tell, and the ambiguity made it so much worse. "So," I said finally, forcing my voice to stay calm, "what does this mean? Are you saying you're done with us?" Laura shook her head quickly, almost too quickly. "No, not necessarily," she said, her voice shaky. I don't know what I want right now. I love you, Mike. I do. But I can't stop thinking about him. And I need to figure out what these feelings mean. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me, like the foundation of everything we'd built over the years was suddenly crumbling. We'd been together for years. Years of memories, plans, struggles, and victories. And now she was sitting across from me, telling me she wasn't sure if she wanted to be with me anymore. It felt unreal, like some bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to let the anger bubble over. So what are you saying? You want to take a break? She hesitated, and then she nodded. Kind of, she said, like she wasn't even sure what she wanted herself. I just think I need some time to figure things out. I was thinking maybe I could take a month to spend some time with Jake, to see if there's something real there. And if it doesn't work out, then we can focus on us. For a moment, I just blinked at her, stunned into silence by the sheer audacity of what she was saying. She wasn't just considering stepping out on our marriage. She wanted my permission to do it. She wanted to test drive a life with Jake while keeping me as a backup plan. You're serious, I said flatly. It wasn't even a question. She nodded, her eyes practically begging me to understand. I know it sounds crazy, but I don't want to throw away what we have without being sure. I don't want to live with regrets, you know? Regrets. That word lodged itself in my brain like a splinter. She was talking about regrets like she was the one taking the risk, like this was somehow her burden to bear, and my feelings were just collateral damage in her quest for self-discovery. I sat there staring at her. Anger and disbelief churned inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Part of me wanted to yell, to tell her how selfish and ridiculous she was being, but another part, the part that was colder and more calculating, decided to stay quiet. Let her keep talking. Let her dig her own hole. All right, I said finally, leaning back in my chair and shrugging like I couldn't care less. Laura blinked, clearly caught off guard. Wait, really? Sure, I said, keeping my voice casual. If you think that's what you need, go ahead. Her expression shifted, like she couldn't decide if I was being sincere or sarcastic. I just think it's the best way to figure out where my heart is, she said cautiously. Sure, I repeated. Do what you need to do. Inside, I was already done. The second she said she wanted to spend a month with another man, something inside me flipped. But I wasn't going to show my hand just yet. If she was willing to throw away everything we'd built for some fantasy with the neighbor, I wanted to see just how far she'd take it. Laura let out a relieved sigh, like she'd just been given permission to be the protagonist in some heroic, life-affirming story. Thank you, she said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. I know this is a lot to ask, but I really believe this is the right thing for us. I pulled my hand away and stood up, grabbing my coffee mug. Sure, I said again, my tone as flat as a sheet of ice. If that's what you need. She didn't say anything after that, just sat there, probably trying to process why I wasn't arguing or putting up a fight, but I was already making plans. Over the next few days, Laura started packing a small bag. She told me she'd be staying with Jake, like it was some casual, temporary thing. She didn't even notice that I wasn't asking questions or trying to stop her. The day she left, the house felt different. Not empty exactly, but quieter, like someone had turned down the volume on my life. And I realized, maybe that wasn't such a bad thing after all. I stood there in the living room for what felt like an eternity after she walked out. The door clicked shut behind her, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder like she was just heading out for a weekend trip, not leaving me and our life together behind. I kept staring at that door, half expecting it to swing back open. But it didn't. And honestly, I didn't feel what I thought I would. No anger, no gut-wrenching heartbreak. Just this weird, almost unsettling calm. It was like the weight of pretending everything was fine, that we were fine, had finally been lifted off my chest. After standing there like a statue, I shuffled into the kitchen. The quiet was deafening, and it felt like every sound, the clink of the glass as I poured water, the hum of the fridge, was mocking me. I leaned against the counter, gripping the glass, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My wife, the woman I'd spent years with, built a life with, someone I genuinely thought I'd grow old with, had just left me. Not just left, but left to figure things out with the guy next door. I mean, seriously, if this weren't my life, I'd probably think it was the plot of some trashy TV drama. But nope, here I was, living it. The first few days after she left were odd. The house felt like it wasn't mine anymore, even though I was the one still living there. It was like she'd left a shadow of herself in every room. Her favorite mug was still sitting on the kitchen counter, the one with the stupid cat face she loved. A pair of her shoes sat abandoned near the front door, as if she might come back and slip them on any second. There was even a blanket tossed over the back of the couch, the same one she'd always used when we binge-watched shows together. At first, I thought about picking these things up, moving them out of sight. But then I stopped myself. Not because I missed her, honestly I wasn't sure if I did, but because I couldn't muster the energy to care. Instead, I threw myself into work. Hard. I started taking on every project that came my way, staying late at the office, even when I didn't have to. Anything to avoid coming back to that empty, echoey house. When I wasn't at work, I was at the gym. I wasn't a gym guy before, but something about pushing my body to its limits felt good. Like I could sweat out all the frustration, confusion, and anger that I wasn't ready to face head on. The soreness in my muscles was easier to deal with than the ache in my chest. It didn't take long for people to start noticing something was off. A couple of friends casually asked about Laura. "Where's she been lately?" And I'd just shrug it off with a vague, "She's staying with a friend for a bit." I couldn't bring myself to say the real reason. Not yet. It felt too raw, too embarrassing. The only person I told the full truth to was my dad. I called him a few days after Laura left, and as soon as he answered, he went straight to the point. "What's wrong?" He's always had this freaky sixth sense about me, even over the phone. I spilled everything. How she'd left, who she'd left with, how blindsided I felt. And when I finally stopped talking, there was this long pause. Then he said, "Well, son, I hate to say it, but it sounds like you're better off without her." That threw me. I'd expected anger on my behalf, or at least more questions, but he just laid it out there, blunt as always. He followed it up with something that hit me harder than I expected. "If she doesn't know your worth, why should you wait around for her to figure it out?" That stuck with me. I'd been so caught up in trying to dissect her decision, trying to pinpoint where I went wrong, that I hadn't stopped to ask what I deserved. And he was right. I wasn't just some fallback plan for her to come back to if her fling with Jake didn't work out. That night, I sat in the dark, staring at our wedding photo on the mantle. God, we looked happy in that picture. So sure of ourselves, so sure of our future. Now, it just felt like a cruel reminder of everything that had fallen apart. By the end of the week, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for Laura to make up her mind. I was done letting her call the shots. The next day, I called a divorce lawyer. Walking into that office felt surreal, like I was in someone else's life. I sat there, explaining everything to the lawyer, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. He listened carefully, nodding, and when I finally stopped talking, he said, "You're well within your rights to file for divorce. This kind of situation falls under irreconcilable differences." Hearing those words, irreconcilable differences, was like a slap in the face. It was so clinical, so matter-of-fact, and yet it summed up everything perfectly. Laura and I weren't on the same page anymore. Maybe we never had been. The lawyer walked me through the process, step by step, and by the time I left his office, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Like I was finally taking back control of my life. Back at home, I started making small changes. I moved some money into a separate account, just in case things got messy. I began mentally dividing up the house. What was mine, what was hers. I didn't touch her stuff yet. Not out of sentimentality, but because I knew the time would come when I'd have to, and I wasn't ready for that yet. I figured I'd wait until things were official. But honestly, in my mind, I had already started piecing together what life would look like without her. I wasn't just thinking about moving on, I was actually planning it. I'd mentally rearranged the furniture, imagined what the house might feel like without her clothes draped over chairs or her half-empty coffee cups on the counter. At first, the days dragged on, heavy with uncertainty, but then they started to bleed into weeks. And you know what? It wasn't as unbearable as I had expected. The quiet, the space, it was almost nice, peaceful even. No more Laura's endless chatter, filling every moment with unnecessary noise. No more petty arguments over trivial things, like whose turn it was to take out the trash or load the dishwasher. It was just me and the silence, and I didn't hate it. Of course, the grapevine had its own way of keeping me updated. A neighbor casually mentioned seeing Laura with Jake at the park, all smiles and cozy body language. Another neighbor, because why mind your business when you can meddle, claimed they'd spotted the two of them tucked into a booth at some downtown cafe. I just nodded along, giving them a polite smile, pretending like it was just water off a duck's back. But inside, I felt this volatile cocktail of anger and pity brewing. Anger because she had tossed aside everything we built for what? A fling with a guy who frankly gave off major commitment-phobe vibes? And pity because I knew how this was going to play out. Jake didn't seem like the type to stick around when things got real. Laura was on a crash course to heartbreak, and she didn't even see it coming. By the third week, I had stopped checking my phone for her messages. I told myself if she wanted to talk, she would. But deep down, I wasn't holding my breath. She made her choice, and I was done waiting for her to come to her senses. One night, while I was clearing out the garage, I stumbled upon this old, beat-up cardboard box. Inside were photos from when Laura and I first started dating. Smiling faces, happy memories. For a second, I felt this sharp pang of sadness, like a sucker punch to the gut. Those moments, those versions of us, felt like they belonged to different people entirely. And maybe they did. Because the more I thought about it, the more I remembered the red flags I'd ignored, the times I had shoved my needs aside for hers without even noticing it. I closed the box, shoved it into the corner, and told myself I didn't need those memories anymore. They were just dead weight. It was almost exactly a month later when Laura finally decided to waltz back into my life. I hadn't heard much from her during her little experiment with Jake. A few vague texts here and there, things like, "Hope you're doing okay," or "We'll talk when I'm back." As if that was supposed to mean something. No updates, no apologies, nothing that even hinted at regret or indecision. It was like I was already plan B, the safety net she could fall back on if things didn't work out. By that point, I'd stopped caring. I wasn't pacing the house, wondering what she and Jake were doing. I wasn't staying up at night, imagining scenarios where she realized she'd made a huge mistake. I'd already filed for divorce. My lawyer had started drafting the paperwork, and in my mind, it was over. But I didn't tell her that. Not yet. When she walked through the door, it was as if nothing had changed for her. She looked put together, like she'd just come back from a spa weekend instead of a month-long fling. Her bag was slung over her shoulder, her hair perfectly styled, and she had this air of confidence that made my skin crawl. Like she expected me to drop everything, throw open my arms, and welcome her back. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag by the door like she owned the place. "I'm back." I was sitting on the couch, lazily flipping through TV channels, and barely looked up. "Welcome back," I said, my tone so neutral it probably confused her. She hesitated for a moment, clearly expecting more. Maybe a fight, maybe a plea. But when I stayed planted on the couch, she walked over and perched herself on the arm of the sofa, her voice soft and careful. "We should talk." I muted the TV, turned to face her, and crossed my arms. "All right," I said. "Talk." She smiled, one of those carefully rehearsed smiles she used when she wanted to smooth things over. "I've done a lot of thinking," she began, her voice dipping into that faux sincere tone that used to work on me. "And I've realized some things. About myself, about us, about what I want." I nodded, keeping my face blank, letting her keep digging. She took a deep breath like she was about to say something profound. "I care about you, Mike. I really do. And I think we can work through this." I think we can rebuild what we have. Rebuild. She said it like it was as simple as patching a hole in a wall, like the last month hadn't been a wrecking ball to everything we'd built. I just stared at her, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. She shifted uncomfortably but pushed on. Jake's a great guy, she said, and I nearly laughed out loud at how casually she brought him up, like we were just talking about some random coworker. But I realized he's not what I need. He's fun, sure. Her voice trailed off, and I just sat there, arms crossed, waiting to see what kind of excuse she'd come up with next. But the thing is, he's immature. He doesn't have the stability that you have. And I think I just got caught up in the excitement of it all. That was it. Her big revelation, her grand confession. She had taken her shiny new toy for a spin, realized it wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and now she wanted her old, reliable back. Uh-huh, I said, my voice measured and calm, the way you'd talk to someone explaining why they thought gravity didn't exist. Laura blinked at me. She must have expected more. Maybe an outburst. Maybe a declaration of undying love and forgiveness. Something dramatic. Instead, she got nothing. I know I've hurt you, she said, her voice softening as she reached out to touch my arm. I stayed perfectly still, resisting the urge to pull away. But I really believe we can get past this. We've been through so much together, Mike. We have history. That's not something you just throw away. I let her keep going. Let her get out all the carefully rehearsed lines about love and second chances and how we could rebuild what she had so casually torn apart. She looked at me like she expected me to start nodding along at any moment, but I didn't. When she finally ran out of steam, I stood up, walked over to the kitchen counter, and opened the top drawer. I pulled out the stack of papers my lawyer had sent over a few days ago. Calmly, deliberately, I set them on the table in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, her voice wavering. "Divorce papers," I replied simply. Her smile faltered. She stared at me, her face pale like someone had just ripped the floor out from under her. "You're kidding," she said, laughing nervously. "Nope," I said, leaning back against the counter with my arms crossed. "I'm not kidding." For a moment, she just stared at the papers like they were written in a language she couldn't read. Then her gaze snapped up to me, wide-eyed. "You're divorcing me?" "Yeah," I said, my tone steady, even. "I'm not interested in being your second choice, Laura." Her shock shifted into anger so fast it was almost impressive. "Second choice?" she spat. "That's not what this is. I was confused, Mike. I needed time to figure things out. And in the process, you decided to test the waters with another man," I said, keeping my voice calm, controlled. "You left. You walked out on our marriage. And now you're back because it didn't work out with him. Do you honestly think I'm just going to take you back like nothing happened?" Laura opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, her face flushing. "It's not like that," she said, her voice shaking. "I was trying to do the right thing. I didn't want to stay and resent you. I thought..." She trailed off, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an escape. "You thought you could have it both ways," I said, finishing the sentence for her. She stood up, crossing her arms defensively. "You're making a mistake, Mike. We can fix this. I know we can." "No," I said firmly, looking her in the eye. "We can't. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." For a moment, I thought she might cry. Her eyes shimmered, her lip trembled, but she held it back. Instead, she just stared at me like she couldn't believe I wasn't falling for her act. The rest of the conversation blurred together, her trying to argue, to guilt me, to bring up the good times, the house, the future we once talked about. But none of it mattered. I wasn't budging. Eventually, she stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. I stood there in the empty space she left behind and felt nothing. No sadness, no regret, no second thoughts. Just a calm, quiet relief. Later that night, I called my lawyer. "She's seen the papers," I said. "How'd she take it?" he asked. "Not great," I replied, lighting a cigarette. "Do you want to give her time to process, or should we move forward?" Move forward, I said without hesitation. Standing up to Laura wasn't easy. It took everything in me to not let her tears sway me, to not let my memories of the past soften my resolve. But it was the right thing to do. She had treated me like an option, like a safety net, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I knew she wouldn't give up easily. Laura wasn't the type to walk away quietly, not when she felt like she was losing. I had barely sat down when my phone buzzed with a text.
This isn't over.
I stared at the message for a second, then locked my phone and tossed it onto the couch. She was right. It wasn't over. Not yet. But it would be soon enough. The next evening, she showed up unannounced, pounding on the door like a storm. "Mike, open the door!" I opened it, keeping my face neutral. "What do you want, Laura?" She pushed past me without hesitation, storming into the living room like she still lived here, like nothing had changed. "We need to talk," she said, pacing back and forth as if the motion alone would make me listen. "You can't just file for divorce without giving me a chance to fix things." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms in an effort to stay composed. "You had your chance," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You made your decision when you left." "That's not fair," she snapped back, her voice rising, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "I didn't leave to end our marriage. I left to figure things out, to make sure I wasn't making a mistake by staying." I couldn't help but let out a dry laugh, the kind that comes from sheer disbelief. "And in doing that, you proved you didn't value what we had," I said, my words sharp and deliberate. "You don't test a marriage by running off to someone else, Laura. That's not how it works." She stopped pacing then, finally turning to face me. Her eyes were red, a mix of frustration and what might have been regret. "I was confused," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "I didn't know what I wanted, but I know now. I want us, Mike. I want to fix this." I shook my head slowly, my resolve unwavering. "It's too late," I replied, my tone steady and final. "You don't get to come back now just because things didn't work out with Jake." Her face twisted in anger, and she pointed a trembling finger at me. "You're being petty," she accused. "You're throwing away everything we built over one mistake." "One mistake?" I said, incredulous. "It wasn't just one mistake, Laura. It was a series of choices. You chose to flirt with Jake. You chose to prioritize your feelings for him over our marriage. And then you chose to leave. Those weren't accidents, they were decisions." She opened her mouth as if to argue, but stopped herself, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of my words had finally sunk in. For the first time, she looked genuinely defeated. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible. I sighed, feeling a pang of pity despite everything. Even after all she'd done, it was hard to see her like this. "That's not my problem anymore," I said, my tone soft but resolute. "You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." She lingered for a moment, looking like she wanted to say something else, but in the end, she just turned and walked out without another word. The divorce process moved quickly after that. At first, Laura tried to drag things out, probably hoping I'd change my mind. She even tried to play the victim with our mutual friends, spinning some tale about me being cold and unforgiving. But the truth always has a way of coming out. My dad, on the other hand, was firmly in my corner. When I updated him on everything, he let out a low whistle. "She's got some nerve," he said, shaking his head. "But I'm proud of you, son. Standing your ground isn't easy, but it's the right thing to do." Laura's attempts to stall didn't get her far. My lawyer was sharp, and the evidence of her leaving for Jake made things pretty straightforward. She tried to argue for spousal support, claiming she'd sacrificed her career for the marriage, but the judge wasn't buying it. In the end, we reached a fair settlement. She got a small amount of money and a few pieces of furniture she'd picked out, but I kept the house and the majority of my savings. The final hearing was bittersweet. Sitting in that courtroom, signing the papers that would officially end our marriage, felt surreal. I glanced at Laura a few times. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days. Her lawyer handed her a pen, and for a moment I thought she might refuse to sign. But eventually, she scribbled her name at the bottom of the page, sealing the deal. After the hearing, she approached me in the hallway. "Mike," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for everything." I looked at her, searching for the person I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But all I saw was someone I used to know. "I know you are," I said. "But sorry doesn't fix this." Her eyes welled up with tears, and she reached out as if to hug me, but I stepped back. "Take care of yourself, Laura," I said, turning and walking away. Every now and then, I'd hear bits and pieces about Laura through the grapevine. Jake had apparently moved on to someone else not long after she came back to me. She was living with a relative now, trying to figure out her next steps. At least that's what one mutual friend told me. I didn't feel any satisfaction in hearing about her struggles, but I didn't feel sorry for her either. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. One day, I ran into her at the grocery store. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I could see the guilt etched all over her face. She gave me a small, awkward wave, but I just nodded and walked past her. There was nothing left to say. Looking back, I don't regret how I handled things. Laura thought she could have it both ways, that she could leave, explore her feelings for someone else, and come back to me when it didn't work out. But life doesn't work like that. I've learned a lot about myself through this process. I know now that I deserve someone who values me, someone who doesn't see me as a fallback option. And if that person is out there, great. If not, that's fine too. For now, I'm just focused on rebuilding my life on my terms. Laura's trial run with Jake may have been her idea of finding clarity, but for me, it was the wake-up call I didn't know I needed.